In 1288, on a quiet river in Southeast Asia, something impossible happened. Warships slammed into invisible barriers. Timbers cracked. Fire leapt across wooden decks. Men screamed as iron-tipped stakes tore open hulls. The tide pulled backward. And the most powerful navy on Earth collapsed in a single afternoon. This was the Battle of Bach Dang. Hundreds of Mongol warships destroyed, thousands of soldiers killed or captured. Their admiral, Omar Khan, dragged from the water in chains. For the Mongol Empire, the greatest military machine in human history, it was a catastrophe. But this victory did not begin here. It began decades earlier. And it began with an empire that believed it could conquer the world. For nearly a century, the Mongols had been unstoppable. Born on the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, they rose under Genghis Khan with a brutality and efficiency never seen before. Their armies moved faster than any force on Earth. Their cavalry could travel up to 100 miles a day. They carried composite bows that pierced armor. They used psychological terror as a weapon. Cities that resisted were erased. Populations were slaughtered. Those who surrendered lived. Those who didn't vanished, from China to Persia, from Russia to the gates of Eastern Europe. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. It was the largest contiguous empire in human history. After Genghis Khan's death, his descendants continued the conquest. And among them rose one ruler who would attempt to finish what his grandfather had begun: Kublai Khan. Kublai was not just a conqueror, he was a builder of states. He completed the destruction of the southern Song dynasty, bringing all of China under Mongol rule. He established the Yuan dynasty. He inherited the world's largest population base, the richest agricultural lands, and the most advanced shipbuilding industry on Earth. By the 1270s, Kublai Khan commanded the Mongol cavalry, Chinese engineers, Korean shipyards, Persian administrators, a multi-ethnic imperial war machine. His empire had crushed kingdoms across Central Asia. It had shattered Muslim caliphates. It had conquered Korea. It had annihilated the Song dynasty. Only one region remained unconquered in mainland East Asia. A small tropical kingdom to the south, Dai Viet, modern Vietnam. To Kublai Khan, Dai Viet was insignificant, a humid land of rivers and jungles. A minor tributary state, a footnote on imperial maps. But Dai Viet stood directly between China and Southeast Asia. It controlled critical trade routes, and it refused to submit. So Kublai Khan sent his armies. The first invasion came in 1258. Mongol cavalry poured across the northern frontier. They defeated Vietnamese forces in open battle and captured the capital, Phang Long. But something unexpected happened. They couldn't stay. The city was empty. Food was gone. Villages were abandoned. Fields were burned. The Vietnamese had withdrawn their population into forests and mountains, carrying everything edible with them. The Mongols, masters of rapid conquest, suddenly found themselves starving. Disease spread. Horses died. Local resistance harassed supply lines. After only weeks, the Mongols were forced to retreat. It was their first failure in Southeast Asia. Kublai Khan was furious. He returned in 1285 with a much larger army. This time, he attacked from multiple directions. From the north by land, from the south by sea. He sent his son, Prince Togan, to command the invasion. More than 300,000 troops were mobilized. The Vietnamese capital fell again. The imperial court fled. To outside observers, Dai Viet appeared finished. But once more, the Vietnamese refused to fight conventionally. They abandoned cities, they destroyed crops, they disappeared into rivers and jungles. Then they struck back. Vietnamese forces ambushed Mongol columns, they attacked supply depots. They isolated enemy divisions. Key Mongol generals were killed. Entire units vanished in swamps and forests. In a stunning reversal, Vietnamese troops counterattacked along the Red River. At Ham Tu, at Chuang Duong, at Tay Ket. The Mongol Southern Army was annihilated. Prince Togan barely escaped, hiding inside a copper tube as he fled north. For the second time, the Mongol Empire had been expelled. It was in humiliation unlike anything Kublai Khan had experienced. From Central Asia to Eastern Europe, his armies had crushed every resistance. But this small kingdom had defeated them twice. To Kublai Khan, Dai Viet became more than a rebellious province. It became a stain on imperial honor, a living insult. So in 1287, he ordered something unprecedented, not conquest, annihilation. Kublai Khan prepared the largest overseas expedition in Mongol history. He mobilized nearly 300,000 soldiers. He assembled more than 600 warships. He organized massive supply fleets carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of rice and fodder. He integrated Mongol cavalry with Chinese infantry and naval forces. This was not a raid. This was a full-scale imperial extermination campaign. Prince Togan was again placed in command. Veteran generals were recalled. Admiral Omar Khan was assigned control of the main battle fleet. And a massive transport armada, led by General Zhang Wenhu, was tasked with feeding the entire invasion force. The plan was simple: invade Dai Viet, occupy its cities, destroy its army, starve its population, replace its leadership, erase resistance. Kublai Khan believed sheer weight would finally crush this stubborn kingdom. On paper, Dai Viet had no chance. Its population was perhaps 1/10 that of Yuan, China. Its army numbered maybe 200,000 at most. Its navy consisted mostly of small rivercraft. It lacked heavy armor. It lacked siege engines. It lacked imperial resources. Against the Mongol Yuan war machine, it should have collapsed. But Dai Viet possessed something the Mongols underestimated: a commander who understood how empires die. His name was Tran Hung Dao, born Tran Quoc Tuan. He was not king, he was not emperor, he was a general. But in Vietnamese history, he would become something more: a guardian, a strategist, a symbol of national survival. Tran Hung Dao had grown up in betrayal. His father had been forced to surrender his pregnant wife to the Vietnamese king. On his deathbed, that father made his son swear revenge. He told him to take the throne, to reclaim honor, to rule. Tran Hung Dao refused. Instead of pursuing power, he chose unity. He reconciled rival royal factions. He rejected internal rebellion. He trained officers. He wrote military manuals. He built a network of loyal commanders. He transformed the Viet's fractured aristocracy into a single war leadership. He did not build an army. He built consensus. Tran Hung Dao understood something few generals ever grasp. You cannot defeat a superior empire by matching strength. You defeat it by destroying its system. And systems depend on logistics, on morale, on geography, on time. By 1287, he knew exactly how the Mongols fought. He had studied them for 30 years. He had watched them advance. He had watched them starve. He had watched them retreat. Now he prepared to end the war permanently. As Mongol armies crossed the northern border once again, Tran Hung Dao ordered a familiar but devastating strategy: scorched earth. Villages were evacuated, food stores removed, livestock driven away, fields destroyed. Thang-long was abandoned. Once again, the Mongols captured an empty capital. Once again, they found no supplies. But this time, Tran Hung Dao planned something far more lethal. He had identified the empire's weak point, not its soldiers, not its ships, its stomach. Hundreds of thousands of Mongol troops required enormous daily rations: rice, grain, horse feed. Without constant resupply, the army would collapse. And all that food was coming by sea from China, on slow, heavily loaded transport ships, led by General Jiang Wenhu. Tran Hung Dao dispatched one of his most controversial commanders to intercept it, a disgraced naval officer named Tran Hung Dao. Hung Dao had once been stripped of rank and reduced to selling charcoal. Now he was given one chance at redemption. At Van Doan Harbor, Tran Hung Dao ambushed the Mongol supply fleet. Fire arrows struck rice ships, transport vessels burned, cargo sank. Jiang Wenhu fled in panic, abandoning most of his fleet. Almost the entire Mongol food supply was destroyed. When news reached Prince Togan in Thang-long, his army had already begun rationing. Horses were dying, soldiers were sick, morale collapsed. The invasion force that Kublai Khan had assembled at enormous cost was suddenly starving. And Tran Hung Dao had not lost a single major battle. Now he closed the trap. With land routes harassed by guerrillas and mountain ambushes, Prince Togan was forced to retreat by water. There was only one viable escape path: the Bach Dang River, a tidal estuary with narrow channels and violent currents. Tran Hung Dao knew this river. He had studied its tides. He consulted local fishermen. He learned exactly when the water rose and when it fell. He ordered thousands of iron-tipped wooden stakes driven into the riverbed, angled toward the sea, invisible at high tide, deadly at low tide. He positioned archers in forested banks. He concealed fleets in side channels. He waited. On the morning of April 9, 1288, Mongol warships entered Bach Dang. They saw Vietnamese boats retreating. They pursued, confident, hungry, desperate to reach open sea. The tide was high. The stakes were hidden. Then the water turned. The river began to drain. One ship struck first, then another, then dozens. Hull after hull split open. Warships collided. Men fell into burning water. Vietnamese fire rafts surged forward. Arrows rained from the shore. The Mongol fleet disintegrated. Admiral Omar Khan was captured alive. More than 400 ships were destroyed. Prince Togan fled by land, hunted through mountain passes. He escaped only by hiding inside a metal tube. Once again, the Mongol Empire had been defeated. But this time, it would never return. Kublai Khan never invaded Dai Viet again. His empire had reached its southern limit, on a river few outside Asia had ever heard of, by a general who refused a crown, and by a people who chose survival over surrender. This is their story. He was born into betrayal. Tran Quoc Tuan entered the world during one of the darkest moments in Vietnam's royal history. His father, Prince Tran Lu, had been forced to surrender his pregnant wife to the reigning king. The woman carried Tran Lu's child. That child would grow up to become Tran Quoc Tuan. It was not a political marriage. It was not diplomacy. It was coercion. The royal regent, Tran Thurs Du, demanded the transfer to secure a male heir for the throne. Tran Lu resisted. He raised troops, he rebelled, but the rebellion failed. His soldiers were executed. He was spared only because the king was his younger brother. From that day forward, Tran Lu lived with humiliation and with hatred. He raised his son to become strong. He hired the best teachers. He trained him in classical literature and military tactics. He prepared him for one purpose: revenge. On his deathbed, Tran Lu grasped his son's hand and delivered a final command. "If you do not reclaim the throne from me, I will not rest in the afterlife." It was not a suggestion. It was an order. Tran Quoc Tuan inherited something few men ever carry: a legitimate claim to power, and a moral wound that could justify rebellion. He could have become king. No one would have questioned it. But history would turn on the choice he made next. Tran Quoc Tuan grew into a formidable presence. Contemporary records describe him as tall, composed, and intellectually gifted. He mastered Confucian classics. He studied military strategy. He trained relentlessly in martial arts. By early adulthood, he was already recognized as exceptional. But inside, he carried his father's resentment. He knew what had been stolen. He knew the injustice. And for years, he remained silent. Then came a moment that would define his life. Tran Quoc Tuan fell in love with Princess Thien Than. She was the daughter of the king, his cousin. When the court attempted to marry her to another prince, Tran Quoc Tuan did something reckless. He entered her chambers at night. The scandal could have destroyed him. Execution was possible. Only intervention by his adoptive mother saved his life. The king reluctantly allowed the marriage. But the incident revealed something important. Tran Quoc Tuan was not submissive. He was capable of bold action. If he wanted power, he knew how to seize it. Years later, as his father lay dying, Tran Lu repeated his demand: "Take the throne. Restore my honor." Tran Quoc Tuan listened. And then he did something extraordinary. He chose not to obey. For most men in his position, revenge would have been inevitable. But Tran Quoc Tuan understood something deeper. Vietnam was fragile. The Mongols were expanding. Internal conflict would destroy the kingdom faster than any foreign army. If he pursued personal justice, Dai Viet would collapse. So he buried his father's hatred. He rejected his inheritance. And he made a decision almost unheard of in royal history. He would become a servant of the state. Not its ruler. He would defend the throne that could have been his. This was not weakness. It was strategic restraint. From that moment forward, Tran Quoc Tuan began reshaping himself. From prince to general to unifying force. The Tran dynasty was divided. Two royal branches still carried resentment from the forced marriage decades earlier. These divisions threatened everything. Tran Quoc Tuan confronted this directly. He sought reconciliation with Prince Tran Quang Khai, the son of the reigning king. Their fathers had been rivals, their families estranged. But Tran Quoc Tuan approached him personally. He boarded Quang Khai's boat. He shared wine. He bathed him in perfumed water as a sign of humility. It was an intimate political gesture, one that shocked the court. From that day forward, the two men worked together. The fracture inside the royal family began to heal. Tran Quoc Tuan also eliminated rebellion closer to home. One of his own sons suggested seizing the throne. Tran Quoc Tuan drew his sword. He nearly executed him on the spot. Only desperate pleas from family members stopped him. From that day on, he refused to look at that son again. He sent a message that echoed through the kingdom. There would be no civil war. Not while he lived. By the early 1270s, the Mongol threat was growing. China had fallen. The southern Song dynasty was destroyed. Kublai Khan ruled East Asia. Vietnam stood directly in his path. The court turned to Tran Hung Dao. He was granted supreme command, not because of birth, but because of trust. Tran Hung Dao began building something unprecedented. A national defense system. He traveled constantly, inspecting regional garrisons, training officers, standardizing drills, recruiting talent from every social class. His residence at Van Keep became a military academy. Young nobles trained alongside peasants. Former fishermen learned naval tactics. Blacksmiths became weapons engineers. He selected commanders based on merit, not lineage. Among them, Pham Ndu Loo, a farmer who impressed Tran Hung Dao with his focus and discipline. Yat Kiu and Dai Tuong, elite swimmers and river fighters. Trong Han Siu, a scholar who became one of his closest strategists. Tran Nhat Duat, a multilingual diplomat warrior. He surrounded himself with specialists, not aristocrats. Tran Hung Dao understood that morale mattered as much as weapons. He treated soldiers like family. He shared their food. He lived among them. He punished corruption. He rewarded loyalty. His troops began calling themselves the Father and Son Army. It was not symbolic. They meant it literally. He also wrote 2 military manuals. One was a condensed guide for officers. The other a strategic doctrine rooted in terrain, psychology, and timing. He studied Chinese classics. He adapted Mongol tactics. He emphasized flexibility over rigid formations, small units over large blocks, ambush over confrontation. He taught that wars are won before battles begin. By controlling movement, by starving enemies, by shaping morale. And in 1284, as invasion loomed, he delivered his most famous message, the proclamation to the officers. It was not propaganda. It was emotional warfare. He spoke of ancestors, of loyalty, of shame, of honor. He warned that surrender would make them slaves, that collaboration would curse their descendants. He told them he would gladly die if it meant victory. Soldiers carved 2 words into their arms. Set that. Kill the Mongols. It was not rage, it was resolve. Tran Hung Dao did not build an army. He built unity. He aligned royal authority, military leadership, and civilian resilience. Farmers became logisticians. Villagers became scouts. Monks carried messages. Women transported supplies. Children warned of enemy movement. Dai Viet became a network. Every river, every forest, every mountain village. It was total defense. He also practiced psychological precision. When Mongol envoys arrived and behaved with arrogance, Tran Hung Dao met them dressed as a monk. He drank tea calmly while their guards pressed arrows against his skull. He did not flinch. The Mongols left unsettled. They had faced cities. They had faced armies. They had never faced this kind of composure. Tran Hung Dao was not impressed by power. He was not intimidated by threats. He was already preparing their defeat. In 1285, during the second invasion, the king asked Tran Hung Dao a question that still echoes in Vietnamese memory. Should we surrender? Tran Hung Dao answered without hesitation. Execute me first, then surrender. Those words stabilized the government. They stopped panic. They clarified purpose. From that moment forward, there was no ambiguity. Vietnam would fight. even if it meant annihilation. That clarity would carry them through the worst months of occupation, through starvation, through exile, through the fall of their capital. And when they counterattacked, they shattered Mongol divisions across the Red River Delta. By the end of that war, Tran Hung Dao had become more than a general. He was the spine of national resistance. But he also knew the Mongols would return. Empires do not accept defeat quietly, so after 1285, he did not celebrate. He reorganized, he retrained, he prepared for extinction-level warfare. He also demonstrated something rare among victorious commanders: restraint. He did not purge rivals. He did not centralize power. He returned to his estate at Van Keep. He continued teaching, writing, training, planning, and waiting. By 1287, scouts began reporting massive troop movements north of the border. Shipyards were working day and night. Supply convoys were assembling. The Mongols were coming again. But this time, Tran Hung Dao was ready. Maps showed enemy routes. Tide charts were complete. River stakes were prepared. Commanders were positioned. The nation was mobilized. When Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, Dai Viet did not panic. It evacuated. It concealed. It waited. Because Tran Hung Dao had taught them how to survive, and now he would teach them how to end an empire. Map fades in. Mongol forces begin moving south. Tran Hung Dao understood something that most generals never learn. You do not defeat an empire by killing its soldiers. You defeat it by destroying its logistics. When the Mongol armies crossed into Dai Viet in late 1287, they expected resistance. What they did not expect was emptiness. Thang Long, the capital, was abandoned. The royal court had withdrawn. The population had vanished. Granaries were empty. Livestock had been driven into the mountains. Wells were poisoned. Bridges dismantled. Fields burned. There was no celebration, no confrontation. No victory parade for the invaders, only silence. The Mongols marched into a city with no people. They occupied palaces with no servants. They camped in marketplaces with no food. They had conquered territory, but they had captured nothing that could sustain them. This was not retreat. It was strategy. Vietnamese history calls it scorched earth. But Tran Hung Dao's version went further. He did not merely deny resources. He erased them. Every village along Mongol supply routes was evacuated. Every storage depot dismantled. Every fishing fleet recalled. The countryside became a vacuum. For the Mongols, accustomed to living off conquered populations, this was catastrophic. They had brought horses. They had brought weapons. They had brought soldiers, but they had not brought enough food. And they had entered a land determined to starve them. Prince Togan, Kublai Khan's son, commanded the invasion. He had led the previous campaign. He had been humiliated. Forced to flee inside a copper tube while his army collapsed behind him. This time, he came prepared. He brought fewer cavalry, more infantry, and a massive naval component. The Mongols had learned from defeat. They no longer relied on overland supply. Instead, they constructed something unprecedented, a floating lifeline, a supply fleet. It was commanded by Zhang Wenhu, a former Southern Song officer who had surrendered to the Yuan. His assignment was simple: deliver food, 70,000 tons of grain, enough to feed Togan's army for months. Rice, millet, dried meat, horse fodder. Everything the invasion required traveled by sea. Hundreds of transport ships. Escorted by warships under Omar Khan and Fan Ji, this fleet was not a support unit, it was the invasion. Without it, the Mongol army would die in Vietnam. Tran Hung Dao knew this, and he designed the war around it. While Togden advanced inland, occupying Phang Long for the third time, his soldiers began to feel hunger almost immediately. They foraged villages, they raided abandoned homes, they slaughtered oxen. They dug up roots, but it was never enough. Vietnam's tropical climate accelerated spoilage. Mold spread through Mongol rations. Horses grew thin. Men fell sick. Dysentery tore through camps. Malaria appeared. The army was bleeding strength without fighting a battle. Togden waited for Jiang Wenhu. Every day, messengers scanned the coast. Every morning, officers climbed observation towers. The fleet had to arrive. Otherwise, nothing else mattered. Tran Hung Dao now executed the second phase of his strategy. He activated his naval trap. At Van Doan, a remote archipelago controlling access to the Gulf of Tonkin, he placed a single commander, Tran Can Do. Can Do was a controversial figure, brilliant, reckless, previously disgraced. He had been stripped of rank years earlier and reduced to selling charcoal. But Tran Hung Dao saw something others ignored: experience, instinct, and a willingness to take risks. He reinstated Can Do and gave him one mission: intercept the supply fleet. Can Do had fewer ships, fewer men, inferior firepower. He could not win a direct engagement, so he did not attempt one. Instead, he staged weakness. When Jiang Wenhu's escort fleet approached Van Doan, Can Do engaged briefly, then retreated. His ships scattered, his formations broke. To Mongol observers, it looked like a rout. Jiang Wenhu believed the Vietnamese navy had been neutralized. He allowed his convoy to slow. He ordered rest, anchored his ships, relaxed security. The transport vessels, heavy with grain, drifted in open waters. That was when Can Do returned. He regrouped his forces. He studied the tides. He waited until nightfall. Then he struck. Vietnamese boats surged from hidden channels. Fire arrows flew. Oil-soaked rafts slammed into transport hulls. Flames spread across grain barges, rice ignited. Dry fodder burned like tinder. The supply fleet became an inferno. Jiang Wenhu panicked. He ordered retreat. He abandoned most of his cargo. He fled with a handful of light vessels. 70,000 tons of food vanished in a single night. Some burned, some sank. Some washed ashore and were seized by Vietnamese villagers. The Mongol invasion had lost its stomach. Tran Hung Dao later summarized the strategy with brutal simplicity. He did not attack armies. He attacked stomachs. News traveled slowly to Phang Long. But when it arrived, it hit Togden like a death sentence. His army was already starving. Now its only lifeline was gone. There would be no reinforcements, no resupply, no winter reserves. The Mongol command structure began to fracture. Units competed for remaining food. Officers hoarded rations. Discipline eroded. Horses collapsed. Soldiers deserted. Disease spread unchecked. Vietnamese guerrillas intensified raids. They struck isolated patrols. They poisoned wells. They burned foraging parties. They left messages carved into trees. You cannot stay here. Togden realized too late that he had not invaded a country. He had entered a trap. Inside the Mongol camps, morale collapsed. Men who had conquered Persia and Eastern Europe now fought over scraps. They boiled leather. They ate rats. They slaughtered their own mounts. Each day weakened them further. Tagan convened his generals. There was only one option: withdraw. But withdrawal itself was dangerous. Vietnamese forces controlled mountain passes. Roads were blocked, river crossings monitored. If Tagan retreated by land, his army would be annihilated by ambush. So he chose water. The Mongols still possessed a large war fleet. If they could reach the coast, they could escape. They would sail north, return to China, regroup, live. The chosen route was the Bach Dang River, a wide tidal estuary leading directly to the sea. It looked safe, navigable, unobstructed. Tagan believed speed would save him. He did not know that Tran Hung Dao had already transformed that river into a killing field. Vietnamese scouts tracked every Mongol movement. Tran Hung Dao received daily reports. He knew Tagan's army was collapsing. He knew withdrawal was imminent. And he knew exactly where it would happen: Bach Dang. He had studied this river for years. He had consulted fishermen, tide readers, river pilots. They taught him its rhythms: high tide concealed sandbars, low tide exposed mud flats, currents reversed violently, channels shifted. Tran Hung Dao recognized an opportunity older than Mongol history. This same river had destroyed a Chinese invasion fleet 3 centuries earlier. Now he would modernize that victory. He ordered thousands of hardwood stakes prepared, iron-tipped, sharpened, anchored into the riverbed at precise angles. They were placed where Mongol ships would naturally drift as the tide receded, invisible at high water, deadly when exposed. Infantry units hid in forested banks. Archers occupied ridgelines. Light naval craft concealed themselves in tributaries. The battlefield was assembled piece by piece, patiently, quietly, relentlessly. Meanwhile, Tagan began evacuation. Omar Khan led the naval retreat. Fan Ji commanded rear units. The army split. Water forces would depart first. Land forces would follow through mountain corridors. It was not a coordinated escape. It was a scramble. Tran Hung Dao allowed it. He did not harass the fleet. He did not reveal the trap. He let them move. Because timing mattered more than aggression, he waited for the tide. By March 1288, the Mongol fleet entered Bach Dang. Hundreds of ships, packed with exhausted soldiers. They moved quickly, desperate to reach open sea. Vietnamese light vessels appeared. Engaged briefly, then withdrew. Omar Khan ordered pursuit. He believed he was driving off a final resistance. He had no idea he was being pulled deeper into the estuary. As the Mongols advanced, the tide began to turn. Water levels dropped. Their heavy ships slowed. Then came the impact. Hull met iron. Keels split. Ships listed. Men fell into mud. The river revealed Tran Hung Dao's work. Thousands of sharpened stakes rose from the water like fangs. Mongol vessels impaled themselves. Formations collapsed. Rear ships slammed into wreckage. Forward ships grounded. Panic spread. Vietnamese forces surged from hiding. Fire rained down. Arrows pierced decks. Boarding parties swarmed immobilized ships. Omar Khan fought fiercely. But his fleet was trapped. This was not a battle. It was an execution. When it ended, over 400 Mongol ships lay destroyed. Omar Khan was captured. Fan Ji was killed. The greatest naval force the Mongol Empire had ever assembled ceased to exist. Tagan received the news while retreating inland. He accelerated his escape. Vietnamese ambushes closed in. Mountain passes burned. Bridges collapsed. He fled inside a metal tube again, carried by loyal guards. His army disintegrated behind him. Only fragments made it back to China. The invasion was over. Tran Hung Dao did not celebrate. He ensured pursuit. He secured borders. He reorganized defenses. He wrote reports. And then he returned to Van Keep. He had achieved something no general in history had ever done. He had broken the Mongol Empire at its peak. Not through brute force, but through logistics, psychology, terrain, and unity. The empire that conquered continents had been defeated by hunger. Map zooms into Bach Dang River. Final words of the act. Now Hung Dao chose the battlefield. The trap began weeks before the battle. Tran Hung Dao did not rush. He never rushed. Victory at Bach Dang was not born in a single day. It was assembled piece by piece. Observation by observation. Conversation by conversation. He summoned the elders, river fishermen, tide readers. Men who had lived their entire lives listening to water. They did not bring maps. They brought memory. They told him when the tide peaked, when it fell fastest, which channels drained first, where mud swallowed horses, which sandbars emerged before others. Tran Hung Dao turned oral knowledge into military data. He charted everything. Then he ordered the forest cut. Hardwood trees were felled upstream, limbs stripped, trunks sharpened. Iron caps forged and hammered onto points. Thousands of stakes were carried under cover of darkness. They were driven into the riverbed at precise angles, not vertically, angled forward, facing the sea, so ships moving with the current would impale themselves. Placement was everything, not scattered, concentrated, in choke points, where the channel narrowed. Where water velocity forced vessels together, the center was dense, the edges deceptive. A maze, invisible at high tide, lethal at low. Infantry hid in mangrove forests. Archers climbed riverbanks. Light boats disappeared into tributaries. Firewood stacked in concealed caches. Pitch prepared, ropes coiled, signal flags positioned. The battlefield was complete. Now they waited. The Mongol fleet entered Bach Dang in the early morning. Hundreds of warships. Thousands of exhausted men. They were desperate. They had been starving for weeks. Their commanders had promised escape. Their only goal was the open sea. Omar Khan led from the front. Fan Ji guarded the rear. They believed speed would save them. Vietnamese vessels appeared, small, fast. They harassed the lead ships, loosed arrows, then retreated. Nguyen Koi commanded the bait. He advanced, engaged, then turned. His boats fled downstream. Omar Khan took it personally. He ordered pursuit. Full speed, close ranks. Destroy the enemy and clear the river. The Mongol fleet surged forward. They followed Nguyen Koi directly into the kill zone. At that moment, the tide was still rising. The river was wide, calm. The stakes were invisible. The Mongols believed the Vietnamese were breaking. They believed the battle was ending. They had no idea it was just beginning. Then the water paused, just for a moment. Then it began to retreat, slowly at first, then faster. The river drained. Currents reversed. Ships lost momentum. Keels scraped mud. Then came the first impact. A Mongol flagship struck iron. The sound carried across the estuary. Wood cracked. Men shouted. A second ship collided, then a third. As the water dropped, the stakes emerged. Thousands of them, jagged, angled, waiting. Mongol vessels impaled themselves. Some were lifted. Others tore open. troops fell into sucking mud. Rear ships rammed into immobilized fronts. Formation collapsed. Panic erupted. Omar Khan tried to reorganize. Signals were shouted. Drums beaten. Orders lost in chaos. Vietnamese forces erupted from hiding. Arrows darkened the sky. Fire rained down. Pitch-soaked rafts slammed into stranded hulls. Flames leapt from ship to ship. The estuary became an inferno. Men screamed. Horses burned. Armor dragged soldiers under. Vietnamese light craft swarmed the wreckage. Boarding parties cut throats. Spears thrust upward through decks. Hooks pulled Mongol warriors into the water. Archers on the banks fired at point-blank range. The Mongol navy, the pride of Kublai Khan, disintegrated in minutes. Omar Khan fought until his ship was surrounded. He was dragged from the wreckage, bound, captured alive. Fanji attempted escape. His vessel struck a stake. Vietnamese soldiers boarded. He was killed where he stood. More than 400 Mongol ships were destroyed. Some burned, some sank, some lay impaled on iron. The Bach Dang River ran red. Bodies clogged channels. Weapons floated downstream. The world's most powerful fleet ceased to exist before noon. Prince Tagin received the news inland. He was already retreating. Now he was fleeing. Vietnamese forces closed in from all directions. Forest units harassed his column. Mountain passes were blocked. Bridges collapsed behind him. He abandoned supplies. He abandoned wounded. He abandoned command structure. Tagin hid inside a metal tube carried by loyal guards. Again, for the second time in 3 years. This was not withdrawal. It was survival. Vietnamese ambushes tore through the remnants of his army. Pham Ngu Lo led cavalry strikes. Nguyen Che Gia blocked escape routes. Arrows fell from ridgelines. Spears rose from forest shadows. Entire units vanished. Those who survived carried the story north. The Mongols had been defeated, not by numbers, not by strength, but by design. Tran Hung Dao did not pursue glory. He pursued certainty. He ensured the borders were sealed. He confirmed that no Mongol forces remained. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. The war was over. The Mongol Empire would never invade Vietnam again. Centuries later, historians would struggle to explain what happened on that river. They would talk about stakes, about tides, about ambushes. But none of that alone explains Bach Dang. The truth is simpler. Tran Hung Dao turned geography into a weapon. He transformed civilian knowledge into military intelligence. He converted unity into force. He starved an empire. Then he drowned it. The Mongols conquered continents. They crushed kingdoms. They erased civilizations. But they could not defeat a people led by a man who refused to rule, who refused revenge, who chose strategy over ego. Bach Dang was not just a battle. It was the moment the Mongol expansion finally met its limit on a small river in Southeast Asia.